The collapse of the European Union seems inevitable. If Russian gas flows to Europe fluctuate between 0 and 20% of their capacity in the coming months, Europe could face a severe recession in the winter of 2022 and 2023. A recession in which Hungary, the Czech Republic and Slovakia will bear the brunt, suffering the greatest economic impact. As Europe rushes to get enough energy for the winter, national economies struggle with recessions and energy companies struggle to avoid bankruptcy. Even if European countries manage to survive this crisis, the coming winter could end up being the decisive factor that ultimately sinks Europe. Because the energy crisis is real, and if the world's governments don't do something about it, millions of people will pay the consequences. But how did it all start? A host of interconnected factors have caused this gigantic crisis that has brought Europe to its knees. Among them are policies focused exclusively on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, preserving the earth, and reducing polluting energies' impact on our health. As energy became scarcer, supply and demand led to higher prices impacting all sectors of the economy and spreading a sense of instability and unease across the continent. Add to this the effects of COVID-19 and the lack of foresight to the authorities, and it should be no surprise that Europe's economies are facing such a critical moment in their history. However, it seems that all the elements came together to result in this destructive storm that no one seems to know how to stop. The first thing you need to know about this crisis is that weather and economic activity affect gas supply and demand cycles. As the 2020 and 21 winter season was unusually cold in Asia and Europe, both major consumers of liquefied natural gas consumed much more energy than in previous years. To make matters worse, the United States also saw a sharp increase in its energy consumption, which had a major impact on this issue. The freezing weather in Texas earlier in the year was one of those factors that raised concerns about the ability of the US energy infrastructure to cope with extreme weather events. This led the US to discover that it was not as prepared for these unforeseen events as it thought. The situation was worsened by the strong heat waves this past summer. As a result, Europe, the United States, and Asia experienced a sharp increase in energy demand due to high electricity consumption by air conditioners. Meanwhile, our neighbours in Latin America faced a sharp reduction in their energy production due to a drought that affected their hydroelectric production. This global situation meant that many of the LNG cargoes destined for Europe were diverted in other directions. And who was the country that took the lion's share of LNG imports? Obviously, our neighbours in China. At the beginning of 2021, China became one of the largest importers of LNG on the entire planet. Specifically, the Chinese market imported 110 billion cubic meters of this energy resource during this year. On the other hand, Japan and South Korea came in second and third place respectively, taking most of the LNG. At the same time, gas consumption in Europe rose by 25%, the highest quarterly year-on-year increase since 1985. At least, that's what the International Energy Agency data says. So while Europe could not generate power from other more polluting sources, increased competition for natural gas, coupled with rising consumption and Europe's inability to compete against giants like China, meant that Europe would find itself in a rather complicated situation. However, an even more decisive factor led to Europe finding itself in this situation. I think the time has come to talk about Mother Russia. As you may know, the war between Russia and Ukraine has caused great rejection all over the world. And
the invasion, the attack that Russia promised would never happen, has now started.
And Europe was one of the first regions to rise up against the invasion in Ukraine. To punish Russia for the war, the European Union imposed a series of sanctions to increase the cost of the war to the Russian regime. Among these sanctions are those of an individual nature, aimed at putting pressure on the political and economic supporters of the Russian regime. These sanctions include freezing assets and a ban on entry into the territory of some of Russia's most important individuals and entities. In turn, the EU issued a series of massive economic sanctions to reduce the Russian economy's financing capacity. One of those that hit the country hardest was the ban on transactions of assets and reserves of the Central Bank of Russia. In addition, the EU restricted the purchase of Russian sovereign debt and financial flows from Russia. Even some of Russia's banking institutions, such as Sberbank and VTB, the country's two largest banks, were excluded from the SWIFT messaging system. But the straw that broke the camel's back was the European Union's refusal to import Russian coal and oil products. Let's add some context. Russia exports around 5 million barrels of crude oil and around 3 million barrels of refined oil products daily. These account for 40% of its total export revenues. By refusing to import these products, Europe placed Russia in an absolutely unfavorable economic situation. However, the European Union did not expect that these sanctions, which were intended to punish Russia, would end up having strong consequences at home. Without Russia's fossil fuels and coal, the EU would dig its own grave without even being aware of it. In response to these measures, Russia proved unable or unwilling to supply gas to the EU. After the Nord Stream 1 underwater pipeline was shut down indefinitely due to leaks, the continent was shaken to its core. This pipeline stretches 1,200 kilometers under the Baltic Sea, from the Russian coast near St. Petersburg to northeastern Germany. Before these restrictions, Nord Stream 1 had been supplying EU states with 35% of all the gas they imported from Russia. This is why many European leaders suspect that the shutdown of this pipeline for maintenance was no accident. Even if Russia were to prove willing to sell additional gas to Europe, the dramatic increase in energy demand would lead to demand continuing to outstrip supply. What is clear is that the loss of relationship between the EU and Russia has created the necessary conditions for Europe's energy crisis to become a massive phenomenon. The situation could trigger further increases in energy bills for industry and households, and trigger social unrest and factory closures. Without energy, Europe would be unable to function for even another 24 hours. Although Europe has made efforts to migrate to renewable energy sources, the shortage and increase in gas have led many utilities to return to coal. As a result, Europe could suffer major economic and environmental setbacks. As this happens, environmental organizations such as Greenpeace have warned that we are heading towards an unprecedented climate crisis. Unfortunately, these countries planning to move away from coal and use natural gas before switching to renewables have been forced to backtrack on their environmental stance. If this were a temporary setback, and these powers would stick with coal for a while longer before immediately switching to renewable energy sources, we would have nothing to worry about. However, it is well known that as soon as countries switch their economies back to coal, industries and politicians could take years or decades to decide to abandon this polluting energy source. Rising energy prices have also increased inflationary pressure just after the world made its reinforcements to recover from COVID-19. Many wonder if a continent can be so lucky, or whether all of these factors, including the pandemic, could have been orchestrated by third parties. It seems very coincidental that the global fallout from the Russia-Ukraine war occurred shortly after the COVID crisis ended. Regardless of the reasons that led to both events, we are not kidding when we say that European inflation is rising. In the summer of 2021, the energy sector saw a steep 17.4% increase. Meanwhile, the September 2021 European market price for natural gas was 6.5% higher than in 2019. In October, prices spiked further as weather services forecast a cold winter. But let's not forget about another determining factor when discussing European gas prices: the TFT. The TFT, or Title Transfer Facility, is a virtual clearinghouse for Dutch natural gas trading that acts as a reference price for gas in Europe and the world. After the TFT reached a new high and opened at 131 euros per megawatts an hour, Europe faced an anomaly never seen before. Gas prices managed to exceed oil price levels. To supply itself with gas, Europe needs to outbid the Asians. But with China at its economic peak, the EU finds itself in a rather complicated position. Even if Europe could afford other energy sources, gas accounts for 22% of European electricity generation. It would not be as simple as putting solar panels all over Europe and forgetting about Russia and China. Doing so would require an immense investment of money the EU does not have right now. So the most logical solution would be to find another energy supplier. But while Europe is trying to find a solution, energy cost increases have been passed on to many industrial products produced daily, especially energy-intensive products such as aluminium, whose prices soared to $3,000 per metric ton. As reliance on public subsidies to protect consumers from high energy prices continues, recovery efforts by the EU are stifled. Unfortunately, suppose things continue to progress at this rate. In that case, this could result in the EU replacing its gas consumption with oil in its eagerness to avoid collapse. This would be a strong setback against making Europe an environmentally friendly continent. But while some people are concerned about the environmental consequences, others are more worried about their pocketbooks. Among these worriers are European investors, who fear that this situation could lead to stagflation. But what exactly is stagflation? Stagflation is the economic situation of a country characterized by economic stagnation while prices continue to rise and unemployment increases. A situation that seems more and more possible for Europe every day. Without energy, millions of Europeans could end up losing their jobs. And while it is a fact that prices are already rising as a result of gas shortages, it would not be crazy to say that Europe is the region most exposed to this possible scenario. At least, that is how leading investment funds such as Planisphere Investments see it. However, analysts at this company are not the only experts to believe that Europe is in trouble. In addition to the energy crisis, Europe has seen slower growth since the pandemic. After global GDP fell in 2022, only the European region failed to regain its previous growth trend. While GDP fell across the globe, the United States was able to return to its trend due to a rapid recovery in industry and trade. Even the GDP in China increased by 2.3% in 2020. This is why the EU has no excuse to justify the decline of its economy. The second reason Europe could be the region most exposed to stagflation is due to a misperception of central banks. Due to the confinement measures in 2020, aggregate demand decreased drastically, mainly affecting the tourism services sector and the gastronomy industry. The lack of consumption caused business owners, forced by confinement measures, to initially lower their prices in an effort to stimulate demand. However, central banks misinterpreted this fall in price as deflation caused by a shortage of voluntary demand. In other words, they printed more money than the states could compensate for their losses due to confinement. Central bank money printing and supply chain difficulties combined to cause the current high inflation. This situation, aggravated by war-related energy prices, has put Europe in trouble. As Europe is a region whose economy is heavily dependent on its industries, massive increases in the price of raw materials such as oil, coal, and natural gas have severely affected industrial production. This puts the European Union at risk because of its poor relations with one of its main trading partners, Russia. But no matter how much we want to blame the rest of the foreign powers, one fundamental factor should not be neglected when analysing Europe's energy conundrum: the climate. As we have repeatedly mentioned, the climate is a key factor in understanding the European energy crisis. Deaths attributable to cold and hot temperatures exceed 7% of European deaths. While in Latin America, when someone does not pay the electricity bill, they sweat all summer long, in Europe a family dies of cold. In fact, it is estimated that deaths attributable to cold are even 10 times higher than deaths caused by heat on the continent. If Europe cannot find a solution in the coming months, the energy crisis will lead to an economic disaster and the loss of human lives. EU winter gas consumption since 2014 has ranged from 130 billion cubic meters to 148 billion cubic meters. The EU has 79 billion cubic meters in storage, just over 2/3 of its total capacity. In the event of a severe winter, gas shortages would only increase. This is why EU solidarity could be at risk. While sharing gas with neighbouring countries in trouble could help reduce their economic pain, it would come at a high political cost for governments that decided to act this way. Increasing your country's crisis at the expense of helping a neighbouring country could be frowned upon in the eyes of ordinary citizens, who cannot grasp the dimension of these problems. Recently, reports have emerged of German industrial companies importing energy from elsewhere. Since Germany has been one of the most affected countries due to its dependence on Russian gas, what happens in Germany could determine the future of its neighbouring countries. While the EU and companies have been trying to reduce energy demand and limit the gas needed this winter, the most exposed countries will have to make more complicated policy decisions to keep their demand low, deciding between the economy and the lives of their citizens. Among some of these measures, we could expect to see inactive industrial production and the imposition of price increases, and even more drastic restrictions, such as reducing domestic heating use. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia are among the 3 countries that will be most affected by gas shortages, because they will suffer the effects of gas rationing in the German industrial sector. Historically, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia have depended on Russia for almost all of their gas supply needs, and they do not have access to LNG terminals since they are landlocked. Therefore, their energy supplies will come from countries that will also run out of gas, such as Germany, Italy, and Austria. Although Hungary hopes to leverage its warm relations with Russia to gain access to gas, they have no guarantee that the negotiations will succeed. If some of these countries were to fall into recession due to gas shortages, especially Germany, which accounts for a quarter of the EU's GDP, there would be serious knock-on effects for the whole continent. But why should Germany be more worried than the rest of the countries? In addition to its dependence on Russian gas, Germany's industrial sector accounts for almost 30% of its GDP. Therefore, Germany would collapse without access to the necessary amount of energy. The main industries affected would be energy-intensive industries such as steel, chemicals, glass, and fertilizers. This would be followed by the machinery and automobile industries. As a consequence of the closure of some of these industries, unemployment could result in new, less energy-dependent industries being forced to close their doors for lack of consumers able to pay for their products and services. This is why European energy shortages could cause a systematic collapse of nations across the continent. Likewise, the industrial sector in Italy is also heavily dependent on Russian gas, but its geographical location places it in a less vulnerable position to gas shortages than Germany. Nevertheless, Italy's metal and mechanical sectors could be equally exposed. Even Austria's paper industry could eventually collapse due to this crisis. High energy prices are already affecting countries trying to avoid gas shortages, such as Bulgaria, which is characterized by an energy intensity 2.5 times higher than the EU due to its inefficient industrial processes. Likewise, some Western European economies that are not as dependent on Russian gas, but use it extensively, are already experiencing the consequences, such as Spain and the UK. If things continue at this rate, even countries like France, which seem more protected due to their high gas imports, could become victims of the biggest energy crisis in Europe's history. As the crisis spreads across the bloc and citizens express their concerns, it is unclear whether the European Union has the necessary power to put the brakes on excessive energy market increases. Meanwhile, citizens in countries such as Spain, Italy, France, and Poland are now facing unprecedented energy bills that compound the economic problems caused by the pandemic. This is why popular discontent has put the world's governments on high alert, seeking partially effective solutions to curb gas shortages. If a generalized Russian gas cutoff in Europe or Germany were to be triggered, we would have the necessary element for a stagflation scenario. And this is how one of the world's most prosperous continents could collapse. But what do you think of the EU's collapse of the energy crisis? Do you think there is a solution other than restoring relations with Russia? We'll be reading you in the comments. If you want to know more about the impending crisis, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to stay up to date with the latest news. We'll be posting a video soon to keep you updated on what is happening across our planet. Thanks for watching, we'll see you next time.